perfect. Vaheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Vaheguru Ji Ki Fateh. Welcome. It's a pleasure to have you on. I kind of wanted to dive kind of right in, maybe give your audience a little bit of an introduction to what I do, what type of work I've been doing. And then you can kind of introduce yourself as well, though you maybe, somebody like yourself doesn't really need much of an introduction, but so my name is Jvala Singh. I've been working in the field of translation for some time now. I am a second year PhD student at the University of British Columbia. I'm looking at pre-modern or pre-colonial sources, specifically in the Sikh tradition, and working on translating that. So I'm learning Braj, Sanskrit's a component as well. And through my work, I've been coming across this idea in the Sikh tradition of Advaita, of non-duality. And now this is a philosophy that I feel like through the colonial period seems to get relegated. It seems to get forgotten. It doesn't get spoken about much during the colonial period, and there's reasons for that. We can get into that perhaps later, more of a historical analysis. But for whatever reason, come modern time, the way that Sikhi has been spoken about, the way it's been preached, it seems to leave this component out of the general discourse. And that's where I feel like you've been much of a help to bring that out again and speak to that. So with that, I wanted to lead into this discussion regarding this idea of Advaita or non-duality, or even just Ik, how Guru Granth Sahib starts with Ik, and the meaning behind that, and the philosophy. So maybe you could,
I think
yeah.
even just to give you a little bit of a background, I share a lot of the sentiments that you mentioned, that for me, this never really began as an academic exercise, but really when I was first introduced to the idea of the God that we had always been brought up with in Sikhi. I'd been brought up in quite a traditional sort of Sikh family. And we were taught Gurbani, we were taught the basic ideas from our parents, went to the Gurdwara every week. And it's only in my early 20s when I discovered that the God that we've always been talking about was actually fundamentally different to the God that Gurbani is actually talking about. The God of Gurbani seems to be completely different to the God of the Sikh religion that I was brought up with. And that to me was my introduction to the whole thing. And the key difference was that the God of Gurbani is related to me in some way, is somehow connected to me. It's not just this being in the sky that you pray to and you fear and you go to ask for nice things. It was fundamentally connected to the very nature of who you are. And when I got introduced to that, initially as an idea, it fascinated me. But then when I was introduced to the meditation side of Gurmat, to actually go and look within myself, that's where things really started changing. So I've always said to people that I don't claim to be somebody who is maybe technically very accurate, or maybe somebody who studied all the granths, but I almost feel like you don't need to necessarily be a studier of all the granths, when really the Guru is trying to say, go and study yourself and go and find that. So to me, when I understood Gurbani from that perspective, I came to exactly the same conclusion that you did, having read all the history of it, was nobody seems to be talking about it. The God of the Sikh religion, the God in the Gurdwara, was very much this standard, almost Christianized definition of God, which is always something outside of you, always something greater and bigger than you, to be feared, to be respected, but never to be found. There was no concept that you had to find it. If anything, you just had to revere it or fear it. And when I understood that there was such a disparity between my own personal experience, what I was reading in Gurbani and what was being taught was so great that I was compelled to just do whatever I could. And what I could was to do talks like I was doing in at Sikh camps and Gurdwaras anyway, but now introducing this idea. And then later on, it just evolved into a YouTube channel. And then now it's become a full-time charity and what I've dedicated my full-time work to. So it's been an interesting evolution for me as to how did I get to this point where now all of a sudden I seem to be speaking something that seems quite alien to the ordinary Sikh community, but really is not alien to Gurbani at all.
Right. And just for a little bit of a background, maybe we can speak to that a little bit more about the difference in perception and what that kind of creates. You know, you mentioned that looking within, the divinity was very much a part of you, right? And that type of perspective versus a perspective where the divinity is something quite distinctly different from you. It's something you look upon as opposed to you feel. Kind of maybe kind of go into, you know, the differences, what's the effect of that? You know, what's the effect of the community being disengaged with, you know, that key component of the philosophy?
Well, I think the interesting thing there is that we still hear people say very fleetingly these comments like, oh, God is inside you. But that seems to be as far as it goes. Nobody seems to ever want to explore that any further or to try and unpack that in any way or talk about how do you actually go and discover that God within you. That never seems to be part of it. It's just taken for granted that God is inside you, but you don't need to look there. It's still the big Babaji in the sky. And so what ends up happening is you end up with a religion of God worship, rather than a lifestyle of divine experience, a lifetime of divine discovery and awakening. What you do is you shield yourself from yourself. You don't ever look at your own ego. You don't ever look at what's going on within yourself. As long as you're doing the stuff that the God in the sky is happy with, or that his appointed gurus or his appointed messengers have told you, as long as you follow all those rules, then you never need to go and look within yourself. You never need to actually go anywhere. You don't need to touch what's happening in here in any way. All you need to do is just do the right things. And certainly from the things that I was seeing, very much this was the case, that everyone was just convinced that the more you do, so you became, you know, if you were someone who was not a practicing Sikh, the way that you proved that you were a practicing Sikh was that you started doing all the ceremonies and the rituals and the things that were associated. So you would look a certain way, you'd change the way you look, you'd change the Bani that you read, the Sangat that you're with, and then all of a sudden you've done all of these external things and you've convinced yourself, oh, I'm now on the right path. But Gurbani's message is very clear. The right path is going within yourself. So we see this Sunya Manya Man Ki Tapao Antargat Tirat Malnao. The idea of going within yourself is very clear. It starts from Japji Sahib, and it's literally, you can't avoid it. If you read Gurbani, it's everywhere in Gurbani. The idea of Aap-Pachan, recognizing yourself. But that doesn't seem to be the conversation in the Gurdwaras. The conversations in the Gurdwaras is always just about the historical gurus, the historical Gursikhs, and very almost superficial characteristics. So they were really kind, they were really good, they did lots of seva, some of them were walking backwards, and some of them were carrying things on their head. And while I don't deny any of those things actually happened, that's not what a Gursikh is. The Gursikh is the one, as defined in Guru Granth Sahib, as the one who goes within themselves. So we just ended up with this mass of people who say that they're following Guru Granth Sahib Ji, but really nobody is actually talking about what Gurbani is saying that you need to do for yourself.
Yeah, I'm just wondering what amount of space do we allocate? Because certainly, you know, prescriptions in regard to conduct, you know, the Vietnamese and certain prescribed codes, certain routines, you know, for example, waking up early in the morning, you know, bathing, these type of routines are certainly clearly mentioned, and they have a space within the tradition. I'm sure you would agree, right? But if we only focus on those, I guess your point is if we only focus on those, then we're missing the core elements of the philosophy. Like you said, it starts from the start, Japji Sahib, right? Maybe you can, I think, dig into even before that, like the ik in Ik Omkar. What does that what does that mean to you in terms of the philosophy? Like how would you conceptualize that, the oneness? Because people think this is a difference here that's I feel like is really important is that if you think of that as one God, then it becomes an external thing. But if you think of that as one unity, right, then your perspective upon the philosophy changes. Maybe you can kind of speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, I think starting with the point on the Ret is absolutely undeniable that it's there. The procedures and the lifestyle that's been prescribed is completely there. What I feel is missing is the context for what that lifestyle is trying to do. That comes from Gurbani. Gurbani tells you what it is that you're trying to do, and it even tells you the how. So once you understand that first, then you understand the reason for waking up in the morning. There's a beautiful line in Guru Granth Sahib that says, Manmukh har har kar thakke, that there's a manmukh way of doing Naam Simran. There's a way of repeating with your tongue and believing that you're doing the right thing, but you're still within the self. So there's the wrong way of doing Naam Simran, and people have not really sort of ever talked about that, and I've certainly never heard people bring that idea up. There's a wrong way of doing Naam Simran, so you're only ever taught that doing it. So understanding oneness first, and this is why Guru Granth Sahib is so important in how it's structured. The very fact that it starts with ik, everyone says, oh, it means there's one God. But the idea that you borrow there of this Christian God and you put it in there, I mean, you know a lot more about the history of where that stuff comes from. But the oneness itself needs to be unpacked. And absolutely, like for years when I started my talks, anywhere I would travel, the only thing I would talk about is oneness. You cannot go any further with Gurmat and Sikh philosophy without understanding this oneness. So for me, what's so fundamental about that is, like you said, rather than it being one God, which is an entity outside, it's more like oneness. There is one being here. There's one entity here. The entire universe must be understood as one, which is what in Jap Sahib Guruji talks about, Aneka hai fir ek hai. It's one that looks like many different things. It's one being, call it God if you need to, pretending to be many different things. And so when you understand it from that perspective, you realize that what you are is not something that's separate from God, but really you are God pretending to be you. And that just changes your whole understanding of yourself. The very nature of me is now no longer a actual thing. It's an illusion. The me itself is the illusion. And what's interesting is when you start to understand this idea at the very fundamental level, Gurbani is saying that all that there is oneness. The entire universe is essentially one being that has created many different forms of itself. So a tree isn't something that God created. A tree is God in the form of a tree.
This is
The sky, the birds, the animals, it isn't what God has created. And I think that one of the best examples that I understood of this was where you take this idea of creator. If you look at how we talk about creator, is almost like a painter. So there's God the painter, and then the creation is the canvas, is the thing that he's created.
yeah.
And this is how very much we talk about God as the creator and the creation as separate from God. And so like a painter would draw lots of different images on a canvas, as soon as he puts his paintbrush down, he's separate and the canvas is separate. The painting and the painter are separate. And this isn't actually the right way to understand the word creator. And historically, we look at certain depictions of God in old Hindu mythology. They have a beautiful avatar of God called Nataraj, the dancing God. And that actually gives a much better indication of what Ik is talking about, is that the creator is more like a dancer than a painter. So when the dancer is dancing, this whole universe is alive. It's created. When the dancer stops, the universe stops. So you cannot separate the dance from the dancer, just like you cannot separate us from the universe. So the fact that we are here is like the universe dancing, rather than the God painting us and then just sitting far away and just looking at us.
Yeah, I love that line. Because Gurbani talks about this analogy, and I kind of wanted to get into these different models, these different conceptions In regard to the dancing, there's a beautiful line by Guru Arjan Dev Ji who says this. He says, "Baji gar jaise baji pai, nana rupe ek dikhlaye." So just like a dancer, just like a bajigar takes multiple forms in the same way and deceives people by doing that. Like dancing, will get dressed in another form and dance again. People think it's a different actor, it's a different person. But then it says, sang utar thamiyo pasara tab eko ekankara. So when the dancer then comes off the stage, takes the mask off, they realize it's that one. And then it says the next line, tab ek ekankara. Then people realize it's just that one behind everything. That like substrate.
So one actor playing many different characters is how we must understand it. So what becomes so fundamentally important there is that everything that you're looking at is essentially God acting as different characters. But this is where most people forget the one step. The one in you looking at the other people is also God. So it becomes God looking at God.
This is why I kind of want to dive into this idea of a dream. This idea that the world is a dream gets talked about a lot. Guru Tegh Bahadur is famous of saying this in Slok Mahala Nava, the world is like a dream. It's often misunderstood though, I think. And I wanted to speak about it a little bit because dreams are fascinating in the sense that in a dream, you are manifesting the dream yourself. Yet while you're manifesting the dream, you yourself are also a character within that dream. And totally unrealizing that it's a dream. So you're acting out this character in a dream. You've manifested the entire dream around yourself. You've forgotten that you've manifested it, and you're playing this role in it. And it vanishes in a second as well. So it's often misunderstood, that line. Maybe you could speak a little bit about it as well. Like, why is this idea of a dream used in philosophy? Like, why is the world conceptualized as a dream?
I think what's really interesting about the dream analogy is the very fact that the key component there is you need to be asleep. And so that's the key thing there, is that you are asleep, which means that, as you said, while the dream is going on, nobody's asleep in their dream. They're awake in the dream. So they believe that they are awake. They believe that everything that they're seeing is absolutely real. But the reality is that you're just lying in your bed. No matter where in the world you are, no matter what your dream is showing you, you may be flying or you may be on holiday somewhere. The reality is you're lying on a bed and you're asleep. And so the truth of the analogy, what it's trying to say is that no matter what you think is going on in your life right now, you're doing it in an unconscious way. You've forgotten that there is something inside that needs to be awakened. So as long as you believe the dream, as long as you're completely oblivious to the fact that you're dreaming, as long as you're just absorbed by the illusion of the dream, you're at no point able to snap out of it. And then this is where a guru, enlightened master, somebody has to come to show you that you're asleep. And this is where the analogy becomes something that's really important for you, that we don't have to just, the dream for us doesn't just mean that we're looking at the world and we've forgotten that there's a God. We've forgotten a fundamental reality about ourselves, is that we ourselves are asleep. So then the big question becomes, well, what is the analogy trying to tell us? What is the meaning of being asleep in our life? And really what it means is the dreamer believes that it is real. And so this is where the analogy becomes a little bit, needs to be unpacked a little bit. We believe that this character that we call the myself, me, myself, and I, we believe that this character to be a genuine character. It's like in a play, the character believes it is the character and doesn't understand that there's an actor playing that role. And so that's how we're living our life. And so no matter what you do, as long as you believe that you are the character that you are, like I believe I am Satpal, you believe you are Jvala, as long as you believe that, then it doesn't matter how religious you are or what you're doing in that dream. The true thing is that you must realize the true nature of what you are. And what you are is not you, it is the divine playing you.
Right.
And so What then the key concept that then comes in when you can't talk about oneness without the thing that's stopping your oneness, this thing that's stopping you from experiencing this oneness, and this is where Gurbani really spends the rest of its effort trying to help you understand. The thing stopping you understanding the oneness is then what Guruji calls home, the myself. And again, one of these concepts that's been completely misunderstood as self-importance. Home doesn't mean self-importance, it means yourself. You believe that yourself exists, not that you believe you're more important. And we have some of the real limitations of translation coming in here, where home is translated as ego.
Yeah.
And ego used in normally everyday English is used to mean that I'm superior to you. So as long as you walk around being humble, you believe, oh, well, I'm humble. I'm not superior to anyone. I'm small. I'm a puppy. You're not a das. You know, these kind of languages that we use to pretend that we are humble, that we don't believe ourselves to be superior. Then we think that I've got rid of the home. But no, Gurbani is really saying you yourself, the belief that you are yourself is the thing that needs to be eradicated. So oneness now becomes not a journey about finding the oneness, but about losing the home.
This is something that I think requires a little bit more unpacking in regard to that idea for us, maybe, because we've engaged with it for so long, seem very simple, but that idea is very, difficult to understand. Basically, would you say it's something of the sort of a self-annihilation, like this idea, this hallucination, if it would be, of this conception that you are a thing, that you are something distinct from something else? Is it this concept that needs to be eliminated? And then what does that do then in the world if that goes away?
What's really interesting about that is at some point, all analogies and all explanations and concepts have to stop, because you have to go within yourself. You have to experience spending time with yourself and understanding, what am I? And the easiest way the analogy that I feel works really well is if you look at an onion. Every part of an onion is just one layer upon another layer. And the further you go, the more layers you start to unpeel. And really that's what we are. And every part of us that we think is us, really, you have to go further and further within yourself. And the deeper that you go within yourself, you realize that there's one fundamental truth that it's never going to go away. No matter how deep you go into your meditation, that there is a presence within yourself. There is a undeniable experience of being present within yourself. And this is where it becomes difficult to talk about it when people haven't experienced it, when they haven't actually tried it out themselves. And so you must go, and I always tell people, you cannot read this stuff. As much as you read it, which is very important to understand it, at some point you've got to stop reading the wisdom and start reading yourself, and start actually going within yourself and understanding, what am I? What is the nature of me? What do I believe myself to be? And you can, with the right guidance, you'll understand, well, I believe myself to be this body. I believe the thoughts in my head. I believe all of the attachments. And Gurbani really talks about these three things, tan, man, dhan. These three ideas that you hold on to, that you're attached to: your body, your thoughts, your opinions, and your possessions. So all of these three things are really things that you've got to go within yourself and start to understand, what are they? Who is holding on to them? Who believes that they are the owner of these things? And it comes right down to, when you understand that there is an idea that I am in here. And it's not even an idea, it's almost a fact. It's almost hardwired into you, the idea that you are here. So you're never going to get rid. One of the things that people say when I start talking about this, well, how do I have a conversation with anyone? How do I say I am hungry or I am going to work if I'm supposed to get rid of the I am? You don't need to get rid of the language. I am is a perfectly useful word to use to say I am going to work or I am making a sandwich. It's fine for you to use that word. It's the belief that I am actually here, rather than something else being here. And I suppose the easier way to explain it the easiest way to start unpacking your own self is to look at asking yourself a very fundamental question. What exactly is mine? What exactly is mine? So we believe my body is mine. We believe my thoughts are mine. Certainly we believe that my family, my possessions, my circumstances are mine. But if we twist that question slightly and say that yours, something is of yours, can only be something you created, not something that was given to you. And so then you start to unpack, well, I certainly didn't create my own body, so that's no longer mine. I didn't create anything around me. I might have bought them, I might have worked hard for them, but that was not there. That was not there at one point. I had to go and get it. And then what's left is, do I create my own thoughts? And this is where you can really start to get fascinated by the nature of your own mind. Is, do I create my own thoughts? And with some very simple observations I've been able to demonstrate to so many people, is that you don't actually create the thoughts that are in your head. The thoughts just happen. So even this I am is not something you made. It was something that just evolved in you. And the more and more you start to realize, well, if I'm not my body, and I'm certainly not the stuff around me, and I'm not the thoughts that are in my head, then what is actually mine? What do I actually own? And you realize I own nothing. Everything is borrowed, everything has been given to me. Even the idea that I am, my sense of myself, is also something that's been given, is not something that I have created. And so that becomes a very easy way to understand that nothing is truly mine. Everything belongs to the universe and goes back to the universe. So this is part of the process of starting to now break this apparent concrete thing called the me, the ego, the home. It starts to soften and loosen a little bit. Now, everything is still there. Your body still remains, your thoughts still remain, your possessions still remain, but the idea of you starts to become a little bit hollow. It doesn't feel as real as it used to before.
What risk then I would want to bring up is in like combined with that approach, then if somebody who doesn't have proper instruction goes down that route, as with the case of many hippies in the 70s, 80s, through LSD, use, find themselves in a point where they have ego inflation, for example, where they recognize the fact that, they themselves are not only limited to what's in their body or what's in their head, but they then take on like an inflated ego. They associate themselves in a, let's say, for the sake of terminology, ego sense, as the world. If I'm trying to make that point clear, it's the idea that they themselves are the whole world, but they take it as an individualistic point of view. If you know what I'm trying.
Yeah. And this is the worry when people look at some of the historic figures within various spiritual traditions. Even if you take one of the Mahavakyas of the Ved is Aham Brahmasmi, Tattvamasi, I am that divine being. Mansur was killed by his society for saying Anal Haq, I am God. And so there is a danger, not in the statement, but there can be a danger in the ego. And I think this happens in every part. The ego is so difficult to get hold of. The ego is so difficult to grasp and to really let go of, because at any point you believe you're succeeding and the ego can come back and say, oh, look how much of a gursik I am. Look how spiritual I've become. I'm so much better than all the people who aren't spiritual. So at any point you can fall down this trap. And this is where in Anand Sahib Gurbani says that this path is kaniyotiki waloniki. This is a path that's so thin. It's like walking a tightrope that's as thin as a strand of hair and as sharp as a razor's edge. So it's so easy to fall off this path. But what's interesting about the Gurmat tradition is that the Guru never allows you to take credit for your own enlightenment. In almost every Hukamnama, no matter what it's talked about, at the end it surrenders, that says Guru Kirpa. It's the Guru's grace, it's the divine grace, nothing is happening for you. So what's interesting about Gurbani is that it doesn't allow you to take ownership of your own enlightenment, of your own spiritual journey. Everything is given to this concept or this idea called Guru. Guru is the one who is enlightening you. You have no capacity to enlighten yourself or to be the whole. The whole is being almost taken away from you. So that's why Gurbani, I feel, doesn't overly stress this point that you are God. Gurbani stresses the point that God is everything, including you. So the point isn't for you to believe you are God. The point is for you to concede that everything is God.
Yeah, this is why, you can correct me if I'm wrong, this is why maybe perhaps the devotional side of the practice of philosophy is so important. So in old texts like Gursikh Pak, this is attributed to Bhai Mani Singh. Some Sikhs come up to Mani Singh and they ask him, why on some hand Gurbani speaks about, non-duality, on the other hand they speak about devotion. How are we supposed to reconcile these different approaches? And Bhai Mani Singh writes there that according to one's different problem that they have, just like as a doctor is going to assess somebody who comes in, he's going to take his pulse, he's going to see what type of illness he has, and according to the illness, then he's going to prescribe that type of medicine. So Gurbani is layered with different perspectives, albeit this non-duality perspective is one. But do you think then it's merged with a devotional concept to ensure that there's no ego inflation, to ensure that you always have something to hold on to in terms of teachings through the Guru's teachings, and in terms of a focus, in terms of meditation towards like Gurmat or any other type of mantra used in Gurbani?
I think devotion is a really interesting idea, because when you have the idea of devoting to someone, what's really interesting about that is it's very easy within bhakti, within devotion, to create a duality. There's me, and then there's a God that I'm devoted to. What an idea that's fascinated me is, how does devotion fit in with non-duality? Is it one or the other, or can you have non-dual devotion? And I think it's very possible, and I think this is where the interesting thing about what Gurbani is trying to do is, it really tries to sit comfortably in this area of non-duality and devotion as well, which I don't think necessarily have worked in the past, but Gurbani seems to do it really well. And the idea there, certainly on a very simplistic level, is that you have to surrender to something bigger than you. You have to completely allow yourself to fall in love with this idea that you're connected to something much greater than you. And I think love becomes a really interesting part of devotion here, because in love, you lose your sense of self. Anyone who's gone through a truly romantic relationship and experience love at a very deep level, you realize that what love does is that it starts to even love starts to break the foundation of what you are, because you and your lover seem to be so close that you can even feel them all around you, inside you, even when they're nowhere near you. You can feel their presence inside you. So devotion is also a very interesting part. What Gurbani is trying to do there is it's trying to give you the non-wisdom way of doing it. You don't have to calculate devotion. You don't have to read devotion. It's just something that you practice. It's not something that you need to go and read the books about. It's a very practical way of connecting with that wholeness, with that oneness. But you've always got to do it under the guidance of the Guru. The Guru has to constantly remind you, hey, don't fall so in love with this outside thing that you forget that it's also you. So the devotion then becomes mind singing to the greater self. And I always say that devotion is not me singing to God, it's mind singing to the totality. And so the mind has to realize within the devotion that the purpose of the devotion is to lose the sense of self. You cannot do devotion always to a God that doesn't affect you. The devotion can't always be God calling. It has to be something which is God realizing. that you singing that everything is you, this is you, tu hi, that eventually you fall so deep into that devotion that you lose your sense of self. So the destination is always the same, whether you take the Gyan Marg or you take the Bhakti Marg, the destination is exactly the same, which is to lose the sense of individual self.
Right. It's interesting, in like interpretive frameworks written down by people like Bhai Mani Singh and Bhagat Mala, it mentions how, for example, the Bhakti Marg, like you said, will take you there, albeit it solves different problems. So if the student, if the Sikh has a different type of problem, you know, that prescription, that way of devotion, that way of practice is better for them. So they talk about somebody who has the problem of vikshepta, so a mind that's constantly wandering, or like a mind that cannot focus. For them, the practice of devotion, for them to attach their focus onto something, that makes the best sense for them. For somebody who doesn't have that problem, for somebody who has the problem of agyanata, so that it would be resolved by removing the parda, the veil of ignorance. And for that problem, that's where the Gyan Marg comes in. So it's interesting that in the old text you have different prescriptions, albeit they sit side by side, and Gurbani is layered in multiple ways, and often in ways I think that's meant to speak to all perspectives. So even in Gurbani, we can agree that there's points in there that do speak about Karam Kand as well. So, certainly Gurbani does instruct us on what to do, what not to do in terms of, good practices and bad practices, right? I mean, that's got to be in there as well. So, the three perspectives about Karam Kand, doing good action, Upasana Kand, having a devotional practice, and then Gyan Kand, having a spiritual or practice that is going to eliminate this ignorance of, the self, the individual, are all layered, I think, in Gurbani, which is something that we can speak a little bit more about. When you think about the story of, the warriors of Guru Gobind Singh alongside Bhai Kanhaiya. So, I mean, most of our listeners probably have heard that story about Bhai Kanhaiya, somebody who was out in the battlefield, serving, oftentimes the Turks, the enemies of the Singhs who were fighting. And the Singhs obviously were not happy about that. They brought him to Guru Gobind Singh saying, this guy's a traitor. He is helping the people that were trying to fight. What should we do with him? And Guru Gobind Singh, as most listeners probably know, didn't helped him, actually gave him supplies, allowed him to continue his practice, saying that his perspective is different than yours, but that's acceptable. And he's reached a state of enlightenment where he doesn't see a duality in terms of Sikh, Muslim, Turk, Singh. So, these perspectives can work alongside each other, correct? Like, do you think even if somebody's going down a devotional path, there's space for the other side as well? What do you think?
Yeah, and I think what's interesting is that people haven't necessarily understood that within Sikhi there are multiple different routes to enlightenment, and I think we've very much got this idea in modern Sikhi that there's a one size fits all solution. But really, even if you look at Gurbani, there are some verses in Gurbani that are purely devotional, and some that are very clearly down the Gyan Marg of self-realization. There's a beautiful line that talks about Kathata Bhakta Sunata Soe Aap Bichare So Gyani Hoye. The one who is speaking and the one who is listening is that divine itself, and the person who goes and self-reflects, Aap Bichare So Gyani Hoye, they're the real Gyani. So that's really talking about the Gyan Marg. But then you've got so much Gurbani that's just pure Bhakti as well, which is pure love and devotion for the divinity. So, and within one person's journey, you might actually go through many of these different things. I know for me, Bhakti is something that came a lot later. Actually, the Gyan and the wisdom was something that I actually got introduced to a lot earlier, where the concepts were so important to me. And actually, I reached a point where I almost didn't want any more concepts. I didn't want to read anymore. I didn't want to be able to conceptualize it, I wanted to now find what is the beauty of bhakti, what is that love element of it, which you don't get from reading about it and conceptualizing and intellectualizing it. And that takes a whole new direction, because there you've got kirtan, you've got music, you've got sahaj. And then for me, then having my experience with meditation, which is your dhyan marg, and going down that path where, again, when you're in meditation, the concepts are meaningless, because you're so absorbed with the experience of stillness, tranquility, sahaj, sun. All these concepts come in Gurbani, and people need to be able to experience all of them and kind of taste all of the different flavors of enlightenment and divinity, because Gurbani has all of them. Gurbani has all the different techniques. It's not even restricting you to one thing, because it isn't trying to be a philosophy. It isn't trying to say there is one way. It's basically saying, here are all the different options, and no matter which one works for you, you're going to get to the end point, as long as you have the Guru, which makes Gurbani so phenomenal that it actually is a spiritual guide of all the major different ways of enlightenment, whether it's meditation, whether it's conceptual, whether it's seva, or whether it's bhakti. All of the different options are in Guru Granth Sahib. And we need to allow people the room to explore all of these different aspects, rather than just kind of giving them a one-size-fits-all solution.
It's really interesting you mentioned there, like, I wanted to speak about that a little bit in regards to, wisdom itself, gyan itself. People talk about gyan. What does it mean? There's two types of gyan that people speak about. There's paroksh gyan. Paroksh means pare aksh, from somebody else's eyes. So books, for example, give paroksh gyan. They give conceptions. They give metaphors. They give analogies, to speak about what wisdom is like. But when you were speaking about, meditation, finding it within, that would be called aparoksh gyan, not through somebody else's eyes wisdom. So direct knowledge versus indirect knowledge, which is really important. In historical texts, it's really interesting. When they mention the routine of Guru Hargobind, like I'm going through some of the stories of him, when he wakes up in the morning, it says the first thing he does is bathe, and then he does meditation upon Nij Sarup, his own form. And what does that mean? Does it mean he's like looking at his arms and saying, oh, like wicked, I'm strong or something? Like, he's looking within himself to the Sarup, the form that is, throughout the entire world, which is quite probably an idea that would be shocking a little bit, to meditate upon oneself, to meditate upon, the substratum of the entire world. Which is really interesting. He gives prescriptions like this as well. There's a story that Guru Hargobind, it's a really funny story. You mentioned actually that line in Gurbani, you mentioned that Manavuks will, do Naam Simran, but they'll do it the wrong way. And this story actually relates to that, because some Sikhs had that question for Guru Hargobind. Said, we're doing Naam Simran, it's not working. What's going on? So his response is, there was a story once, he tells them, he says, one time there's a cat that fell into a well. And the villagers went to the local wise men and they said, hey, there's a cat in this well, what do we do? And the wise man said, all right, first thing, number one, remove the cat. Second thing, take 100 barrels of water out of that well, and then it'll be clean. So the villagers went and did that, and they said, all right, we're going to go do that. They forgot to remove the cat. They take the 100 barrels out, and, a couple of days after, they say, hey, the well is still smelly. It's giving bad water. What's the problem? The guy said, did you remove the cat? And he said, oh, damn, we forgot the first thing. And so they said, remove the cat. Then slowly over time, the water will become clean. And Guru Hargobind said in the same way, first, you have to remove this idea of oneself, of home, and then slowly over time, through your practices, through devotion, through gyan, then you will begin to clean yourself. And it's something that's often forgotten when we talk about, you mentioned people with these terms about, das and sevak and stuff, and a lot of these times they're just superficial terms about humility. And they've not really really taken in the full extent of what humility means, right? And how that's really the first path to, entertaining any of these paths, where we talk about the Bhakti Marg or the Gyan Marg. But I just wanted to carry it further a little bit because we only have 10 minutes left. I wanted to talk about what this philosophy does to one's perception, how they interact with the world differently when they start to see consciousness everywhere. For example, people talk about three states of avasthas, three states of being. Jagrat, awake state, Supanavastha, dream state, and Sukopa, deep sleep. Deep sleep. And in many ways, consciousness has been conceived of being, all-pervading. Consciousness does not only reside in the minds of humans. Consciousness is even in a rock. It's even in a dog. It's even in a cat. And I think that's a much more holistic way of thinking about life and consciousness. And in many ways, it kind of eradicates this ego that people have over themselves, that, only people feel pain, only people can think. Dogs, animals, the rest of the world is in many sense unconscious, and it's, just gross matter. It's not important. But when we try to extend, this idea that consciousness is everywhere, so people think about how dogs are in supanavastha, that dogs are in the state of dream state. They're just doing whatever they're doing. And when you have, leaves and trees and rocks and stuff, they're in the state of deep sleep. So when somebody's in the state of deep sleep, if it's cold, they'll still move, they'll still adjust. So in the same way, like a tree, when it feels sunlight, the tree will still adjust towards the sunlight. It's just it's just basically a framework to extend consciousness into other thoughts. I wanted your opinion on that your thoughts on that idea as well. Once we have this idea that the individual is an illusion, what does that do for us in the world?
I think that becomes when we start talking about consciousness, and I think there are a couple of traps no matter what word we use. So for me, I'm starting to now see the traps of limiting God to consciousness, and there's been a movement in certainly in the last many years that people have now started to equate God is consciousness. Previously, we used to see this word God is love. And so what they try and do is they limit God into one definition. And I don't feel Gurbani allows us to do that. So I don't necessarily even say God is consciousness. God is conscious, no question about it. If we take the primal definition of whatever this oneness God is as Sat Chit Anand, then Chit is one aspect of it, that it is conscious. But when we start saying that I have consciousness, so consciousness is in everyone, and then, it becomes a logical exercise where people are saying, well, is the tree conscious and is the rock conscious? So one of the things I've had to do is I've had to try and strip away some of the wording for myself, is that now rather than saying that the consciousness is in everyone, because people's understanding of consciousness is different, and certainly the scientists are arguing whether consciousness is something that we are in, or is it something that the brain produces? And this is the ultimate question of neuroscience that hasn't been solved yet. So rather than kind of entertaining that discussion, what I actually reduce it down to something simpler is the essence of life that is in me is also in everything else. So even at a most basic level, the thing that creates me and the thing that keeps me going, life energy is the simplest way that I put it. Life energy is also in me, is also in everyone else. And this, for me, makes the terminology and the entire concept of God so much easier. When we say that God is in me, nobody really knows what that means. And if we say God is in everyone, nobody knows what that means. The character of God is, we have to just pretend that it's in everyone. One of the things that I think about is when people talk about God, is God the ultimate imaginary friend? And are we saying I'm imagining that God is in me and I'm imagining that my friend is in everyone else? So that becomes not so useful. So when we start to change terminology, it makes it so much easier to experience. The question that you're asking is that how does it change our experience? So I ask this question, is life in me? And that's an obvious answer. Yes, the life is in me, life energy is in me. Is universe in me? Yes, it's in me. Is universe in the tree? Yes, it is. Is life in the tree? Yes. Is the thing that's in me that we call life energy also in everything around? And then all of a sudden, it becomes so much easier to understand that what we're talking about is a fundamental essence of reality. Whatever created you created everything else. And it's just there. I can't pinpoint it. I can't put my finger on it and say it's exactly this or it's exactly that. It's the consciousness in you or it's this or that. So I just almost put it down to the aliveness in everything. The aliveness in me is in everyone else. And where it changes your experience of life is that when something that you love, remember now, love is an important factor of this. When there's something in you that you love, which is the very energy of your own life, if you have love for that and you see it in everyone else, it by default means that you also then have love and compassion for everyone else, which is where we start to see some of the ideas that Gurbani talks about, is that you don't have hatred, you don't have fear, you don't have the tendency to be cruel to anyone else. There's compassion, there's daya for everyone else. It changes everything all around you. Even the breath that you're breathing is now part of this God. So it's like you're breathing in God, and then what you're breathing out, God is breathing in. So it becomes something that's so close to your experience of life. It's you feel this thing all around you. It's inside you, it's all around you. It just makes such a beautiful experience of life. Life then just becomes such a joy. Just the very fact that you're breathing becomes a joy, becomes something that you are so grateful for, the very fact that you're breathing. And if you can have that relationship just with your breath, imagine the relationship that you can have with everything all around you. Everything becomes God talking to God, and you're enjoying that experience for however long it's going to last.
Right, and that's something that people, across traditions, once they hit a spiritual point, come to that realization, come to that. People talk about, mystic experience, but in Gurbani it talks about, that anand, that bliss that people have who are enlightened, who have reached that point. And it's something that gets talked about a lot in Gurbani in regard to, somebody who's spiritually accomplished. Whatever they're doing, they are receiving that bliss. They're in tune with that bliss, which is really interesting when we think about kind of the tension, anxiety, the guilt that most people have during spiritual practice as they, begin to entertain these ideas about religion and spirituality and tradition. Largely, it's based out of this guilt or fear. And it's interesting that I feel like the end root of that is the exact opposite. It's, quite a realization of bliss and happiness and, unity with everything around it. So we just have about 5 minutes left. I did want to speak a little bit. I mean, we could take questions as well. I do see a lot of questions here. Perhaps you would like to answer some of these?
Sure, yeah.
Oh man, there's quite a lot here, but I think one thing I did want to touch on is this notion that this martiality. So I come across a lot of texts from the 18th century, so in the 1700s, that talk about this importance in the Sikh tradition that you have a martiality. And one thing I always found really interesting about the martiality concept is that in these old texts, it's married with this idea about non-duality. And I always found that really interesting, that it would be paired with that, because a lot of times, for example, when people talk about war in Western, academic circles, people talk about how in the need of war, there's a demonization. People, even reduce their enemies to animals, and they demonize their enemies, right? But in the Sikh context, for example, you have this mention in Bhai Mani Singh's writings as well, is that when Guru Gobind Singh was writing Dasam Granth, when he was writing, his poetry, he wrote that. Bhai Mani Singh's explaining the need for Guru Gobind Singh's writings is that not only was there martial components within his writings, but he was also giving that level of gyan, that level of wisdom, so that the warriors themselves would go into battle fearless. They would understand that this idea about the individual is false anyway. That what need to protect, something that's going to be turned into dust anyways in a few years. Why would there be such an importance on that? So I found that really interesting how he was blending, and I'm not sure that's really been spoken about much nowadays in terms of people view martiality, people view that side of Sikhi as quite distinctly different from, ideas about wisdom and enlightenment and spirituality, to the extent that you even have other groups. People think of the Nihangs being on one side and the Nirmalas, being on the other, and they're quite distinct. But in history, you have people like, by Maharaj Singh, by Bir Singh, even by Mani Singh's, all of his kids were warriors who ended up, attaining Shahidi, who fought in battle, ended up eating steel there as well. So maybe it's something you can kind of touch on as well. How do you yourself conceive of that apparent duality between the two philosophies?
I think Gurbani talks about this quite a lot, and it really comes down to, again, understanding the fundamental concept of one actor playing many different roles. And we certainly see that this is a major theme even prior to Gurbani. If you look at something like the Bhagavad Gita, Arjun is asking Krishna, how do I engage in this battle when the so-called enemy are actually members of my family on the other side? So how do I fight them, because they're supposed to be my enemy, but they're also my family members? And Krishna's response is, you have to play your role in this whole game. That this is an entire game that's being played, and your role is to be on this side, and the divine is playing all the different parts. We look at Guru Gobind Singh Ji, the very fact that he calls his autobiography a natak, a Bachittar natak, this beautiful game, this play, is that he's very aware that there is one being, oneness, one character, one actor playing all the different roles. And so you realize through your own spiritual practice that you cannot die. There's a part of you that cannot die, and then there is the physical part of you that will definitely die. When you relate yourself to not the body, not the mind, but you associate, you identify with the infinite part of you, then the physical becomes irrelevant. And this is why they were so willing to die, because they had already done that part of their dying. They'd already done the death. They'd already committed that this body is going anyway. They've got that level of realization, but they also realize that everything around them is also going to die. So there isn't this kind of guilt, or should I kill this person, or there is no me. There's just an understanding that the wholeness is playing all the different parts. But I think it's important that you don't use that as an excuse, because a novice is going to look at this answer and say, well, that gives you a free license to do whatever you want. Then you can just go and kill anyone or commit any sort of crime, because you're saying, hey, oneness is doing it to oneness. Yes, that's always a problem, but that's your focus is not to get away with murder. Your focus is, am I connecting with my divine sense of self?
We have just 10 seconds, but that is a good way to wrap up. I just want to thank Satpal Singh. I want everybody to go to Nanak Naam, the site, and also check out the Suraj podcast. So thank you again, Satpal Singh.